I'd love $1 for every time someone has said to me that they would like an expat Kiwi to fill the role. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think, first of all, Kiwis offshore tend to have deep-end experiences where they're involved in large-scale offshore, and some of the bigger organisations that we represent are grappling with scale, and there's not many people that have got that experience locally. So for many of them, the holy grail, if you like, in our search process is finding someone offshore at a time in their life when returning home suits, and the assumption being that they've got the Kiwi values, they know how the culture works here, they know how organisations work, and they're going to fit and transition back very well. Our advice would be that as soon as you've decided that you're going to come home, whether it be in 1 year or 2 years' time, then the process of planning should begin. So begin by trying to understand a bit about the local market, do some reading, connect with people through the Kiwi Expat Association and others who are in like industries or industries that you'd like to be part of. Reach out to them, make phone calls, emails, begin some exchanges so that you can then plan, we would argue, a series of reconnaissance missions to New Zealand, ideally not just purely in the peak holiday season, but ideally outside of that. And you quarantine some time then to catch up with people informally. We would argue, don't be afraid of picking up the phone. In many markets offshore, senior executives are almost impossible to reach. One of the beauties about doing business in New Zealand is that some of our organisations' leaders are very accessible and in fact welcoming of Kiwi talent coming back. So use the informality of the culture here to your advantage. Use the fact that you're a Kiwi and you're going to have connections, so you're going to start way ahead of others who might have got their permanent residency but yet to move here, and plan and get out here, get face to face with some decision makers as part of your journey home. So invest time and money in getting here, building those relationships over a sustained period of time. The first thing is to be planned. The people who I've observed have transitioned very successfully have perhaps engaged over a period of about a year. They've had a number of reconnaissance trips, ideally not timed in January when many Kiwis are around for the traditional long holiday here when many people aren't at work, but perhaps other times of year that they spend a week and then maybe a 3-month gap, another week. And during those times they're building relationships, they're getting a sense of the market, they're reconnecting with old networks, and they're generally finding out where in the market they might fit. Because one of the challenges, of course, is that the market here is very small. So if you're offshore in Singapore, you're in London, you might be in the US, those markets are awash with opportunity at the senior level in terms of the volume. Here we've got a much smaller volume of opportunity, and therefore, we would argue you have to be that much more strategic and clever about how you approach it. New Zealanders offshore, one of course is the tyranny of distance by very virtue of the fact they're offshore, and time zones and so on. And the other is, I think, the relationship aspect of the economy here, that there's so many jobs, so many senior appointments are made through personal relationships, and the informal economy is very vigorous. So how do you tap into that as an expat offshore? I mean, clearly you're ahead of the game compared to, say, a would-be New Zealander who's perhaps got their permanent residency offshore and migrating here, but that is one of the key challenges. One of them is taking the first thing that comes to them. I think in the ideal world, you're really looking to create, have a number of opportunities to look at the same time. And if you can't do that, then certainly get very, very clear on the criteria that constitute a successful move back, so that you can assess any potential job against those criteria with some objectivity. And the second mistake, perhaps, as mentioned, is the lack of planning. So is to plan the move in a similar way that you would plan a move into a different geography for work purposes. I experienced one of two backgrounds. One is they're very senior bankers, and they come to New Zealand and realise that the financial services sector is tiny, and certainly aspects of the financial services sector, such as investment banking, are very, very small compared to offshore markets. And for many of those, it's often thinking about changing their career completely. So they might end up doing something quite different, maybe a board positions and a non-executive director career, or they might choose to sort of reinvent themselves in another way, because actually fitting back into a local bank here would be from a career point of view, perhaps a negative experience for them. And the others would be people who worked in multinationals exclusively. There are one or two organisations in New Zealand who really appreciate multinational talent, because they are themselves structured in a matrix sort of way, and that they get that they understand the sort of matrix reporting and the kind of the dynamics within which a multinational works. But there are very few of those companies, very few multinationals here anything beyond a sales office, and therefore, in particular for those individuals, helping translate those experiences into something that's meaningful and relevant to the local market, in our experience, has been a challenge. The key thing is to translate it back to the local market. If you're in the US, there'll be job titles like vice president that are unknown here. So if I was in the US and I had vice president on my CV, I would put in brackets equivalent to, and then put the job title that it might be in a New Zealand context. I think the other thing is companies. A lot of companies, for example, you could argue Tesco's incredibly well known in the UK, but less well known here. So I would be putting in, retailer with X number of stores, turning over this amount of money, and then help the reader identify where in the organisation you sat. So I had a role at this level reporting into this division, which had these responsibilities. So if you like, bring it to life for the company, and if you can, identify a company in the local market that's similar. So you might say, I worked at XYZ company, which is a little similar to Mighty River Power in the local market, or whatever it was. So make it come to life a bit, and help the reader translate it and make it relevant for the local market. Well, I'd be very cautious to say don't use advertisements as a means of finding out about the market and even applying for jobs, but it does remain the worst way of getting a job. Okay, so it's a lottery, so you might be a 1 in 100 chance. A lot of people looking at ads will sometimes struggle to understand an expat CV because the companies aren't so well known, and it's the low-hanging fruit will always be in the local market. So as an expat Kiwi, if you've got a background that just fits absolutely hand in glove and meets every criteria on the advert, then possibly worth giving it a call. But I would caution against using advertisements as anything other than an also strategy alongside the main game, which is networks, informal, researching the market, making direct approaches to companies, and so on. An exec search firm can be part of an individual's extended network, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Most operators in the executive search market are fairly low volume, so you're not going to get all the opportunities through only one search firm. The other thing is that the search firms themselves only represent a smaller part of the market, because there's so much that is done by organisations directly or through informal channels. And the New Zealand market is probably one of the most informal in terms of how it approaches executive appointments.